watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. If you are interested in learning Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D fundamentally, please make sure to check out our ultimate introduction to Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D course, which is a massive 10-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for Cinema 4D thoroughly. Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll be trying to create a realistic plastic shader in Arnold for Cinema 4D. Now before that, let's take a look at some reference photos and understand how plastic shaders might look like. So here is a very good example of a plastic material in real world. You can see we have this very nice, beautiful highlights. Obviously, the plastic has a base color component or diffuse component. It's reflective. Now this reflection, depending on the precise type of plastic that you're trying to create and recreate, might be sharp like here, or it might be matte and rougher. And if I compare these, you can see, just go through these examples, you can see we have different types of plastics, rougher, sharper, depending on what you are trying to create. But if I get back to this particular example here, we obviously have a fairly strong Fresnel effect, probably something like 1.6 or 1.7 for the IOR, or the Fresnel reflectivity would be necessary here. And if you take a look at this particular example that we have here, we also have this kind of multi-lobe specular reflections. You can see, if I just zoom in, you can see we have this kind of sharper reflection, and we also have this more diffuse, more spread specular lobe underneath it. And thanks to the new standard surface shader in Arnold 5 and the new coating layer, that basically allows us to have two specular reflection layers in Arnold. It's easy to recreate something like this. Now, prior to Arnold 5, we actually had to do most of this work, for example, recreating the Fresnel, recreating these multi-lobe specular reflections manually, and it was really labor intensive. But the new standard surface shader in Arnold 5 is really powerful and lets us do most of this automatically, and it has some really great parameters to actually do most of this job. Also, if you take a look at this surface, for example, if I zoom in here, you can see the reflection that we see on this surface isn't straight. We get this kind of waviness on the surface, and that simply indicates that the surface isn't perfect, and we have some distortion and some unevenness on it that we need to replicate with for example, a bump map. And also we have some smaller and more detailed unevenness. If you take a look at these areas, for example, here or here, for example, that needs to be basically associated with the bump map as well. Now we can take a look at more example here. For example, the Fresnel effect can be seen a bit better on this particular picture here. You can see the reflection on the parallel faces are less strong compared to the reflections on the perpendicular angles or the edges. So you can see as we move away from these frontal faces toward the edges, or from the parallel faces to our viewing direction to the perpendicular faces, the reflection becomes basically stronger or more even on the surface. So we need to take that into consideration when we create our material. And just going through some of these plastic shaders so you can actually see them. In this particular example, you can see the unevenness on the surface is quite visible in these reflections. You can clearly see we have this kind of larger level on unevenness. You can see this huge wave that distorts our specular highlights that coming from this softbox, and also we have this kind of smaller, more jagged unevenness that also presenting itself. And obviously the specular roughness and the specular weight itself can be also manipulated and be controlled with the texture to just add a bit more variation. We need to also do that when we create our shader if you want to be more and more realistic. Now, another component of most plastic materials is subsurface scattering. Now, this subsurface scattering level can be very low or very high depending on the shader that you are trying to create. For example, you can see we have this obviously very obvious subsurface scattering look that if we try to recreate something like this, we need to probably make sure we have a very strong subsurface scattering. But in a case, for example, like this, the subsurface scattering isn't that visible. It's there, but isn't that visible. So depending on what you're trying to create, you might need to actually add that subsurface scattering and have some subsurface scattering contribution from your standard surface shader. Okay, now you can see in this particular example, we can clearly see that multi-lobe reflections here, and in this case we have these kind of scratches that also if we created something like this, we needed to add those scratches using our bump map and probably in our specular layers as well. But you can see this one is a bit more matte. Okay, so let's get started. Now, if you check out our website, we have two courses called Developing Realistic Shaders in Arnold for Cinema 4D. Both of two courses were recorded prior to Arnold 5, so most of the techniques there are kind of irrelevant to Arnold 5, and not quite irrelevant, but there are some huge changes in the workflow. The new standard surface shader is quite different from the standard shader that we had prior to Arnold 5. The bump mapping workflow is quite different, so we needed to kind of make sure we update those courses. But actually, instead of updating those two courses or recording premium courses, I decided to actually record these tutorials as free videos and upload them to our YouTube and Vimeo channels. Now, I'll be trying to release at least one video per week of these free video tutorials about developing shaders in Arnold, but it might be more, so make sure to subscribe to our YouTube and Vimeo channel. Also, I'm not going to be trying to follow the exact outline of the Developing Realistic Shaders in Arnold for Cinema 4D courses. I'll be trying to kind of maybe adjust some stuff, but you know, it's going to be sometimes a bit different compared to those two courses. Now let's get started and start creating our plastic shaders. Now in this scene, as you can see, we have this kind of plane model, we have kind of this backdrop. For the lighting, if I actually run the IPR, I have this Arnold sky with this HDR I applied to, and you can download the project files from our website, but for now, let me just create a new Arnold standard surface shader, and I'm gonna just open that up by middle clicking, and if I just use a very low weight value for the base color and apply this shader to the plane, you can see the reflection is a bit better. So as you can see, this is our Arnold sky, and this is the only light that basically contributes to the lighting of the scene. We have these three other lights, and if you take a look at their attributes, you can see the diffuse contribution for these lights has been zeroed out. So these lights, if I just get out of the camera, you can see these lights, that additional lights that I have, these three lights are only for specular reflection, so we can have some nice highlights and can basically make sure the material that we are creating stays true to the original plastic references that we were looking at, right? So let me just get back to the camera. So this is our Arnold sky, and this is our specular lights here. Now let's open up the standard surface shader. Just going to adjust this so we can actually see our IPR render as well. Now, probably the most important thing that you need to do is to define the base color for your plastic shader. And in this case, I have this kind of plastic template here, so you can use some of these basic plastic colors like green, red, blue, and yellow. In this case, let's use this green color and press OK. And I'm going to increase the base weight to something like 1. Okay. So let me increase the zoom value to something like 100. Now, I'm not going to be going through the standard surface shader and explain different parameters. We have already done that in our ultimate introduction to Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D course. So you can check out our website mographplus.com and learn the fundamentals of the standard surface shader. We're just gonna learn how to create a plastic shader using the standard surface shader in this video tutorial. So that's the base weight. This needs to be probably something like 1. I'm going to decrease the specular weight, and as I mentioned, we are gonna be trying to create that multi-lobe specular reflections. But before that, if you are trying to create a simple plastic shader, you can simply control the reflection or the specular reflection using the specular weight. So if I use a smaller values, we're gonna have probably something like 0.5, something like that's gonna give us a nice plastic look. The IOR or the Fresnel reflectivity for a plastic can be something like 1.5, 1.6, or even 1.7. In this case, let's try to use something like 1.6 or that's 1.58. Okay. And the roughness value, it really depends on the look that you are trying to create. For example, if I want a more matte and rougher look, I can increase the specular roughness, let's say to something like 0.3. And now we have this matte plastic look. And obviously, if I want a sharper look, I can simply decrease my roughness, let's say to something like 0.05. And now as you can see, we get this sharper look. So in this case, let's set it to 0.1. So this is your very, very basic plastic shader. If you don't want anything specific, you can have a plastic shader like this, and now you can simply change the base color, maybe to something like this reddish color or this bluish color, and call it a day. But if you want to go and create something more realistic like this and have this multi-lobe specular reflection and this nice bump mapping that I described, we obviously need to do a bit more. So let's actually get started with that. I'm gonna just use this green color again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we need to use 2 specular layers. The first layer is obviously our specular component, and we have also this coat component that can be used as a secondary specular layer. Now, what I'm gonna do is to use my specular layer to recreate this kind of more spread, more kind of rough specular layer that we see around this highlight, and I'm going to use my coat layer to recreate this sharper specular highlights that we see on this surface. Okay, so let's create this underlaying layer here, and obviously for this we need to increase our specular roughness probably to something like 0.2, and I'm going to decrease the specular weight as well to something like 0.25. Okay, so that's what we are getting with the specular layer. Now, if I come down to the coat layer, I can obviously add that sharper reflection layer, right? So this is what we have without the coat layer. So let me just hold down Shift and render only this region here. If I increase the coat value, let's say to something like 0.23, and decrease the roughness to something like 0.05, now we are gonna get that beautiful multi-lobe reflections that I talked about. You can see we have this underlying layer which is rougher and more spread, and we have these sharp specular reflections. You can see here it's quite obvious, and we have these sharp specular reflections that is the result of the coat contribution. So that's the basics of the material, and I'm probably going to increase the IOR just a bit to something like 1.6, so the coating is even more visible on the frontal faces that we have. That's good. So this is the basic of a more realistic standard surface shader. Now what we are going to be doing is to try and control the specular weight and the specular roughness, and also the coat weight and the coat roughness with shaders and textures, and after that we can actually add that unevenness on the surface that I discussed using a bump map. So let me get started. Now the way I normally work with most of the shaders is, before actually adding any textures to basically add a bit more variation to a certain value, I try to understand what is the range of the value that I'm trying to work with. In this case, for example, I know the specular weight that might work for this particular shader is 0.26. I know the roughness, the specular roughness, is about 0.2. So when I actually assign a texture, I need to stay true to this particular range of values. So the basic look that I have here will be preserved, but with a bit more variation, with a bit more realism. And the same thing for the coat section. We have the coat weight, which is about 0.21. So if I assign a texture to this particular parameter, I need to make sure the values of that textures are close to this particular value that we have here. So let's get started and control the, first of all, let's start with the specular weight and the coat weight, just to add a bit more variation. Now, another thing that I actually want to mention, just the small tips that I'm going through, when I actually work with shaders in Arnold for Cinema 4D, what I tend to, if I just set this zoom value to 100%, we have this scale value, and this is basically controls the resolution of the IPR based on the output resolution that you have defined here. The output resolution is 1280 by 720. So if I set my scale to 100%, we are using the exact resolution that has been defined in the output section of our render settings. And if I, let's say, use something like 200%, now we are using twice the resolution that has been defined here. And I tend to increase the scale value to something like 200% and just render a small portion of the image. So I can actually see all the details that I want to see, right? So I'm gonna be using these scale values as I'm going through creating this shader, okay? So for now, let me just set the scale to probably something like 100%, and let's start working with the shaders. Now let's press Control Tab and add an image. In this case, let's start with BW19, and this is, if I just connect it to the Arnold Beauty port by Alt W and V, we can see how it looks on the surface. I'm probably going to select the image and go to its UV coordinate tab and try to increase the scale. Want to see a bit more detail. Probably something like 5 and 5 would be nice. Now, if we want to connect this image directly to the specular weight value, what's gonna happen, because this image is mostly black, we are not gonna get that mostly reflective surface that we want. So what's gonna happen, these dark areas are gonna basically use a lower specular weight value, and these white parts are gonna use a higher specular weight value. So we're gonna get a surface that's not as reflective as we want. So what I'm gonna do first of all is to actually invert this image, and for that we can obviously use a ramp float node, you can use a color correct node, or simply you can use what's called as a complement node. So I'm just going to hold down Alt and drag this node on top of my image, and then say insert after. There you go. So now, as you can see, we have basically inverted that image from this, Alt WV, to this. But right now, it's not exactly the range that I'm looking for. These white parts are gonna cause a very reflective surface. And as you know, the specular weight that we are trying to use is about 0.25. So these values are about 1. As you can see, if you in your IPR, if you go to your render view menu, you have this show pixel information, and if I just stay on top of this pixels, you can see we have a value of about 254. So we don't want that white value because it's gonna cause our specular weight to be a high value like 1 here. So if I use something like 0.25, now I'm going to obviously change the range of the values of this particular image that we have here. And you can use something like a range node, which can be very useful, but I tend to use the RAM float node for these cases. So let's drag a RAM float node to the work area. Now connect the output of the complement to the input of the RAM float node. And now let's connect the RAM float node to the Arnold beauty port. And what I'm gonna do is to just try a lower value, probably something like 0.4. Make sure my X value is set to 1. Now I don't want these very dark spots because they're gonna cause the specular weight value to be 0, and we're gonna have no reflection on those areas, and that's not quite realistic. So I'm just going to increase those values to probably something like 0.05, just a tad brighter than a pure black. Okay, now we can use this image to control our specular weight. And what's gonna happen if I just connect this here, specular weight, connect the standard surface shader, and let me, as you can see, I have these AOVs. If I go to the render settings and AOVs, you can obviously select the particular AOVs that you want and add them to the active AOVs. In this case, I have my specular AOVs, I have my SSS AOVs, I have my code AOVs, so you can see how they look. And in this case, let's probably just render this section. Let's make it a bit bigger. Now, as you can see, now we have varied our specular weight value. It's not only 0.26, we are actually using this map to control the specular weight. And if I come down to the specular AOV, you can clearly see this variation. You can see basically we have used that texture to vary our specular weight value. You can see where the texture is black, we get this not reflective areas, and where the texture is white, we get more reflective areas. So that's good, but I want to add a bit more variation to the specular weight. So what I'm gonna do is to actually control tab again and load another image, and this time let's use this smudge 01. Now we have this smudge shader, and if I just press Alt W and V, let me just also decrease the scale to something like 70, so the render would be a bit faster. Now, as you can see, this texture is mostly black, and I want to basically multiply this image over the first texture that we had to add a bit more detail. So what I want to do basically is to convert or invert basically this image. So these white details are black, and then I can simply multiply it over the first image that we have and add a bit more detail to the overall texture that will be controlling the specular weight. Now, to do that, let's use a RAM float node instead of a complement node that we used before. So let's drag a RAM float node, hold down Alt, insert after, input. Now what I'm gonna do is basically, first of all, let me right click and reset this curve, and then I'm going to inverting the map and just add a bit more contrast. Now, as you can see, we start to get that dark details, but before that, actually, let's Alt W V, and what I'm gonna do is to add a bit more scale U and V values so we get a bit more details. Also, I'm probably going to offset it a bit. Let's see, try something like 0.2 or even 0.4. And also the first image that we had, we can probably try to adjust and offset it on U a tad so we get exactly what we want. Probably something like this would be enough. Now come back to this texture, and we were about to add a bit more contrast. Now I don't want to have these very dark spots on this texture because they're going to cause no reflection in these particular areas, and that's not something that we want. So I'm going to raise this point until we get a tad brighter, darker values. So probably something like this would be enough. Now to combine this texture and this one, what we're going to be doing is use a layer color node. So if I just press Ctrl Tab and search for a layer color node, we're going to be using this texture as our first layer. Okay, so let me connect this to the layer 1, and we're going to be using this texture as our second layer, and we'll be multiplying it on top of our first layer. So let's connect that to layer 2, select the layer color node, and increase the layer 2 alpha to 1. Okay, now if I connect my layer color node to the Arnold Beauty, I can multiply the second layer, and this is going to be the resulting texture that we have. Okay, let me just push them aside a bit. Now what we can do is to connect this layer color texture to the specular weight and the coat weight, but I want to personalize this particular texture that we have here for our specular weight and for our coat weight, because if you remember, the specular weight was about 0.25 and the coat weight, I think something like even 0.15 would be enough. So what we need to do is to make sure that this texture, or a darker version of this texture, will be assigned to the coat weight, because the coat weight value will be lower compared to the specular weight value, right? And if you find this concept very hard to grasp, please make sure to check out our Ultimate Introduction to Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D course on mographplus.com, and there we explain all of these concepts quite in detail. But right now we're just trying to create a plastic shader, and I cannot explain every single parameter in detail. Okay, so to personalize this particular layer color output, I'm going to be again using a RAM float node, or you can again use something like a range node, but in this case let's again use a RAM float node. Okay, connect the output of the layer color to the RAM float input, and I'm probably going to connect this RAM float node to the specular weight. So let's probably just make it a tad darker. I think it's a bit too bright for the specular weight value of 0.25 that we had there. So probably something like this would be good. And also I still see some of these very dark spots that I don't want to actually have them, because as I mentioned, they're going to get not reflective, and very dark spots are not a very good thing for a specular weight or for a coat weight texture. So I'm just going to make sure these dark values are a bit brighter, probably something like 0.01, just a tad brighter. Or you can probably increase something like this. Now those dark spots aren't as dark as before if we connect the RAM float to the Arnold Beauty, as you can see. So this was the layer color output, and this was after adjusting it to be used as our specular weight. So now we can connect that to the specular weight value. Let me just control drag this RAM float node, and the second RAM float node will be connected to the coat weight. And as I mentioned, because the coat weight value is lower, we're going to be using a darker texture. So in this case, if I just connect this RAM float node, I'm just going to make the brighter areas of the texture a tad darker, probably something like this. Okay, so this is our specular weight texture and this is our coat weight texture, and they're both coming from this combination of texture that we had before. So let's connect this to the coat weight, and now we can connect the output of the standard surface shader to the Arnold Beauty. And let me just increase the scale to something like 200, and let's just render this section here. So as you can see now, we have this very beautiful specular and coat reflections, and if I check out the specular AOV and the coat AOV, we have added these nice beautiful variations using those textures. This is our specular albedo, and as you can see, this is the texture that has been used to control the specular weight, and this is the texture that has been controlled to the coat weight. As you can see, it's a bit darker, so it's not going to be as reflective as the specular layer, but that's what we wanted for our coat contribution. Okay, so that's good. Now the next thing I want to do is to kind of add a bit more variation in the specular and coat roughness. Now before that, what I want to mention here is that for something like plastics, these variations should be very subtle. I think this is a bit too much for this particular shader that we have, but because I just want to show you the concepts and how those color control the specular weight and the coat weight, that's why I've kind of exaggerated a bit. But for something like plastic, these variations can be a little bit less compared to what we have, and you can do that by obviously decreasing the contrast using a RAM float node or using something like a color correct node. So if I just use this color correct node, you can simply connect the output of your layer color node to the input of the color correction node, for example, and then just start, for example, decreasing the contrast. Okay, so you don't get as much variation as you want. Or you can do the same thing by simply making the dark wall hues and the bright wall hues closer together using a RAM float node. So I can simply just make them closer together like this, and that way the contrast wouldn't be as much. Let me delete this. Now for the specular weight and specular roughness, if I get back to the standard surface shader, the value that we used for the specular roughness was about 0.2, and the value for the coat roughness was about 0.05. So we could have this beautiful multi-lobe specular reflection in which the underlying layer is a bit rougher and the coat layer is a bit sharper. So in result, we can have something like this, okay, or this. So let's now control those two values with a texture and add a bit more variations here. I'm gonna do it, so let me just adjust this standard surface shader a bit. Okay, so let me control tab, load another image, and this time let's use this BW38 blurred, and you can download these project files and these textures from our website roughness.com. The link is in the description. So let me just go to the image that we have. I'm just going to again set the zoom to 100% and the scale to something like 70% so we can take a look at this texture. And obviously you can directly connect the image to this Arnold viewport port here and actually see that texture in the viewport and adjust the texture, but I'm used to kind of using the IPR, so that's why I do it directly in the IPR. So let me Alt WV and take a look at this texture. Probably going to increase its scale again to something like 5. Okay, and this is going to be used to control our specular roughness and for our coat roughness. So let me again drag in a RAM float here, connect the output of the image to the RAM float input. Now I mentioned earlier that I tend to set up these values, and when I connect a texture, we need to stay true to those values as much as possible. Now I'm going to be using this, connecting this RAM float node to the specular roughness, and the specular roughness that we had in mind was about 0.2. So what I'm going to do in this particular RAM float node is to set or think of 0.2 as the main value, as the base value, as the pivot value, and then adjust the curve around that particular value. So if I just connect this RAM float node directly here, this is the texture that we are getting, and in this texture the very white parts are gonna, let me actually connect this directly before adjusting it to the specular roughness so you can actually see what I'm talking about here. Let me just render probably this section and go to the specular. Let me connect the standard surface shader to the Arnold beauty port so you can actually see what's going to happen here. So if I go back to the specular layer, now what's happening in this texture is that if I connect the map directly here again and get back to the beauty port, you can see we have these very dark spots, and the specular roughness value is going from 0 to 1. So if the texture value is very dark, we're going to get a very sharp specular reflection, and if the texture value is very bright, we're going to get a very obviously rough specular reflection. So that's why if you take a look at these dark spots here, they're going to result, if I just again connect it and take a look at the specular AOV, you can see this is exactly what's happening. We have these sharper specular reflections in those darker spots, and we have a rougher specular reflection in this basically brighter areas of the texture. So obviously this is too much for this particular look. So as I mentioned, 0.2 was our pivot value. So what I'm going to do is to set the darker spots to a value something like 0.15 and set the brighter spots that cause this very rough specular surface to something like let's say 0.25. Now we have two values, 0.25 and 0.15. Obviously 0.15 is 0.05 smaller than 0.2, and 0.25 is 0.05 bigger than 0.2. So we basically vary our specular roughness around the original 0.2 value that we had in mind, and we get these nice subtle variations that's gonna do a lot. And for the specular, for the coat roughness, if I just connect these RAM float again, the coat roughness was about 0.05, so we need to stay true to that value. So that's why we are going to be connecting the output of this RAM float node to the, if I just go to the coat AOV right now, as you can see, it's not as varied as we want, even though we have the coat weight, but using this coat roughness, obviously we can add a bit more detail. So let's connect this to the coat roughness, and now obviously it's going to be very rough because we have values between 0.15 and 0.25, and the value that we are interested in is 0.05. So if I just show this in a separate window, the original value is about 0.05, so about here, right? So let's use a value like 0.025 and 0.075. So now we are, as you can see, we are around 0.5 value, which is here. Okay. 0.05 value. It's going to add a bit more variation. That's going to be nice. Okay. So if I just get back to the beauty, so that's the texture that we used for our specular roughness. As you can see, it's a bit brighter compared to the texture that we use for our coat roughness, obviously because the specular roughness original value was about 0.2 and the coat roughness was about 0.05, so we need to use a darker texture to preserve that. And finally, it's time to actually add some bump mapping, that's kind of bumpiness and unevenness that I mentioned. If I just zoom in again, you can see we have this kind of wavy highlights and we have these kind of smaller details, but obviously the most important part of the bump is going to be this waviness and this unevenness on the surface that basically tells us that the surface is not even, and it's going to be adding a lot to the overall realism of the shader. So let me disable this render region and get back to the zoom of 100. And obviously, now before that, let me actually take a quick render, set the scale again to something like 200, and let's render this small region here. Okay folks, so this is the render that we are getting with the texture that we have connected to our specular and coat weight and specular and coat roughness. And as you can see, how these small variations are going to add to the realism of the texture and of the shader, and obviously it's very beautiful. And if I check out the specular and the coat layers, you can see combining those two would give us this beautiful final result. Now it's time to actually work on the bump map, so let's get started. Now obviously the bump mapping workflow has changed from Arnold 4 to Arnold 5. So the first thing we need to do is to add a bump 2D. Okay. And in this case we are interested in a noise to add that kind of waviness, unevenness on the surface, or wavy unevenness on the surface. Okay, let's see how this noise would look on the surface. I'm gonna set the zoom probably to something like 70%. And now let's connect the noise to the Arnold Beauty. If I go to the coordinate tab, I'm probably going to increase this to something like 5 or even 10. Probably something like 12 would be nice. And then connect the output of the noise map to the bump map input. Now we need to connect the bump map or bump 2D node here to the, if I check out the standard surface shader, you can see under geometry we have this normal input, and that's where the bump 2D node will be connected to. Also in this case we have a coat layer and we want this noise to actually affect the coat layer as well, so we also need to connect it to the coat normal. But if I just start to connecting it to the geometry normal and connect the standard surface shader directly to the Arnold Beauty port, now you start to see how this bump map is going to affect the surface. But as you can see, the highlights that are obviously coming, these sharp highlights that are coming from our coat layer, are not being affected with the bump mapping that's happening right now. It's only basically distorting the specular contribution of the shader. But if I also connect this output to the coat normal here, you can see immediately those sharp highlights from the coat normal will be affected as well. Obviously the value of 1 centimeter is way too high for this particular shader, so let's try something like 0.1. And as you can see, we have this kind of wavy unevenness on the surface, especially if you take a look at this highlights here. If we have our IPR, so you can see we have this beautiful unevenness that's going to add a lot to the realism of the overall shader. But I want to add some smaller higher frequency details, not as effective as this layer, but just to have something more detailed. I'm probably just going to use this image that we use for our specular and coat roughness. And in this case, again, we need a ramp float node because I want to personalize this texture for the bump mapping. So let's connect this to the input. Now, if I connect this, what I'm gonna do is to probably just, I don't want to have very intense indents, which these dark spots are gonna cause when this texture is going to be connected to the bump map. So I'm just going to raise this darker values to probably something like 0.6. Now they are not as dark, and also they're not going to be as effective as before when connected to the bump map input. But we already have this noise map, so what we can do is to use something like a mix RGBA node, or again, why not use the layer color node? As you can see, we have a layer node as well, but when you try to layer up texture, you need to actually use the layer color node and not the layer node that is used for surface inputs. Okay, let me use this. Let's first of all, these are the texture for the roughness inputs, and these are the texture for the bump mapping. So let's use our noise map as the first layer, use this ramp float as the second layer, connect the layer to the output. And now if I just increase the layer to alpha, we start to actually see the effect of the second ramp float node, but I don't want to be that effective, probably something like 0.35. It's just going to add some small details, and that's what I want. And now we can connect the output of the layer color node to the bump map here, and connect the standard surface shader to the, again, Arnold beauty port. And let me again set the scale to something like 200 and render small region like this. Okay folks, so here is our final render and our final shader, and as you can see, we have all of these nice details and variations for this particular shader that makes it realistic and beautiful. So that's our specular layer, that's our coats layer, and that's cool. Now, before wrapping up this lesson, I want to quickly talk about subsurface scattering. And as I mentioned earlier in this lesson, subsurface scattering is an important part of most of the plastic shaders, but it really depends. Some of them have it, some of them don't. And in the case of the plane geometry that we worked with, it was a bit hard to actually add any subsurface scattering because of the difference in the thick and the thin parts, and there was this huge bulky section and that very thin area that was impossible to kind of work with. But in this case, we can actually take a look at how adding that subsurface scattering contribution can add a lot to the realism of the shader. So this is the render that we have without any subsurface scattering. Just going to take a snap, and if I open up the shader, I can simply go to the subsurface section, probably just increase the weight to something like probably something like 0.2, and instead of this white color, let's use this green color, and probably something like even 4 or 5 centimeters. Let's try 5 centimeters for the subsurface radius. And as I mentioned earlier, this concept has been explained in detail in our ultimate introduction to Arnold for Cinema 4D, to Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D. So make sure to check out our course at mographplus.com if you are not familiar with these parameters and values here. So now that we have these values, let's wait for the IPR, and then we can compare it to the render that we had without the subsurface contribution. Okay, so here is the render, and if I take a snapshot and compare it to the previous render without the subsurface scattering, as you can see, it adds that extra level of realism. We can probably use a higher weight to actually see the effect a bit better. So let's try something like 10 centimeter for the weight. Okay, let's now take a snap again. And if I compare it to the first render without subsurface scattering, you can clearly see the difference here. Let me just, so that's without subsurface scattering, and this is with subsurface scattering. you can see that's that little bit of extra realism. And depending on the shader that you are trying to create, for example, if you are trying to create something like this, obviously you need to increase the subsurface scattering weight to make the effect more obvious, but in most cases a small value of subsurface scattering can add that extra realism, but obviously it's going to add to your render time, and you need to obviously increase your subsurface scattering samples in your render settings to get rid of the noises that caused by that effect. But in general, that's about adding subsurface scattering to the plastic shaders. Now back to our own scene, we can obviously now go for a final render. If we wanted to, in this case, we can obviously adjust the output, probably increase the resolution, and go to the Arnold render tab, and for final render we might need to increase the camera samples, probably something like 5 or 6. We need to increase our diffuse samples, especially in this case the specular samples need to be increased to make sure we don't have and we don't get any indirect specular noises. Okay, so for this particular render, I'm just going to use a 1280 by 720 resolution just to have a render in this tutorial, but you can check out the high resolution renders on our website roughness.com. I think the render settings are good enough. Also make sure to increase the light samples. Right now the Arnold sky samples is about 4, but this light has a sample value of 1, so if you want to avoid any direct specular noises that's coming from these light sources, we need to obviously increase the sample value. So I'm going to just select all of them and increase the sample value to about 4. Okay, and now we can just take a quick render. Okay folks, so here is our final render, and as you can see we get all of these nice and beautiful details, and this is how you create a realistic plastic shader in Arnold for Cinema 4D. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Vimeo and our Facebook and Twitter pages because we are going to be releasing tons of free tutorials like this discussing developing shaders in Arnold for Cinema 4D. So see you next time, guys. Thanks for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. If you are interested in learning Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D fundamentally, please make sure to check out our Ultimate Introduction to Arnold 5 for Cinema 4D course, which is a massive 10-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for Cinema 4D thoroughly.